Thank you. Well, thank you. Well, it's always a pleasure to come to a place where everything's up to date. Out in Salina, Kansas, why we're trying to get up to date and making a little bit of progress now and then, but only because we see what's going on in Kansas City. What I'm going to do tonight is risky, and I'm going to need patience and probably help. I worked hard on this talk, and I worked hard on it partly because I knew I was coming here, and a lot of you folks have heard me over the years, and I know some of you will say, yeah, I saw that slide about 20 times. But I am going to be risky because there's something at work that needs corrected. And it isn't going to be easy to make this correction in the course of where we are given in the course of scientific history. A convenient time to spot where things started to go wrong was 1600. But I don't think it's a good idea to move very close to the Big Bang in trying to determine where problems started. We could go all the way back to the formation of mammals and primates, I suppose, and say, I think God is probably saying, next time, no brains. But I'm going to work my way into this, and I'm afraid that maybe things will, put it this way, I think maybe things will get clarified in the discussion period. Now, 33 years ago is when my mind began to change after reading the General Accounting Office study of 1977. We started the Land Institute about 33 and a half years ago. And in 77, the GAO put out this study in which it looked like soil conservation, at least to me, looking at the report, was as serious as it was when the Soil Conservation Service was formed in 1935. It was then called the Soil Erosion Service. And Roosevelt put at the head a very energetic and imaginative man, Hugh Hammond Bennett. Thousands of miles of terraces, grass waterways. The Wellington Brink said, never in modern government had an organization been put together with more esprit de corps, from the stenographers to the PhDs in soil science, devoted to the common task of saving our soils. And I read once, and I've never been able to find the reference again, but I don't doubt it, that at one time, 1/7 of the total federal budget was devoted to soil and water conservation. But that was back in the CCC days, a lot of make-work projects. So it's easy to imagine. So when I saw that GAO study, I thought, how can this be? And but I also had some students, interns, and I took them to the prairie, the Konza Prairie, which was just getting underway. Lloyd Holbert, the ecologist there, gave us a wonderful field trip, and something got set off that corresponded with that GAO study, and that is, here we were out on the prairie, and there's no soil erosion, no fossil fuel dependency, no epidemic, a renewable economy. And in thinking about it, you know, here's a wheat field or a corn field or a soybean field or a sorghum field or a whatever, any of the grains. There's soil erosion, fossil fuel dependency for fertility and traction, chemical contamination for herbicides, pesticides, and so on. And so that's sort of what set me off. And there are two things. One is the prairie features perennials and in mixtures. So a lot of my talks over the years have had to do with our efforts to perennialize the major crops. I'm going to talk about that a little bit tonight, but only to touch on it. Mostly what I want to talk about is the other factor of that prairie, and that is the prairie itself, the ecosystem. And the ecosystem as a conceptual tool for the management of our land resource. And the reason I'm emphasizing it is because it seems to me that the momentum is gaining to go to the other end of the spectrum, the more reductive end of the spectrum, toward, say, the molecular end of the spectrum to deal with our problems in agriculture. So the perennial versus the annual, and now first, you know, let's be clear on a distinction between a perennial and annual. A perennial is a plant that just keeps coming up every year on its own from the roots or the rhizomes. An annual, you've got to plant seeds. So first of all, agriculture is, grain agriculture features annuals. Nature's ecosystems generally feature perennials. That's the first. Next, let's be clear about what I mean, at least, by ecosystem. And I want to maybe get a little bit better, maybe the lights come down a little bit. Okay. Here's a hierarchy of structure. If you start with the ecosphere, downward in the ecosphere, or the whole earth, are ecosystems like prairies or rainforests or alpine meadows or desert scrub, whatever. Identifiable slabs of space, time. Below that, organisms. Below that, organs, tissues, cells, molecules, down to atoms. So this is sort of a hierarchy of structure that a man by the name of Feibelman back in the 1950s wrote a paper in which he talked about the laws of integrative levels. The laws of integrative levels. And they're very general laws, but going up the hierarchy of structure into the realm of organisms, and he got up to organisms, and then the question became, what's next? Some said species, some said populations, and J. Stan Rowe, an ecologist in Saskatchewan, University of Saskatchewan, says, well, what do the other categories have in common? What they have in common is contiguous volume. Species don't represent contiguous volume. Populations don't represent contiguous volume. But this slab of space-time, like a prairie, you can think of it in a three-dimensional way, sort of way, if you want, going down into the soil and above, where you count both the physical as well as the biological as a unit. That contiguous volume, and he says, Stan went on to say that well, it became clear that Feivelman's 12 laws of integrative levels fit for ecosystem where it didn't fit when it was populations or species. So, now, in the discipline of ecology and its Siamese twin discipline of evolutionary biology, there is a tendency to look at an ecosystem as a container, as a place where things happen within, but not having what we might call emergent properties of its own. Now, think of a rainforest. A rainforest has a lot of species in it: plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, viruses, and so on. But that rainforest has the emergent property of being a major regulator of the hydrological cycle of the planet. So one reason we're interested in saving the wild biodiversity is because of these slabs of space-time that have a role in the whole ecosphere. So I want to be clear that I'm regarding, this is my bias. I think it's important to state our biases, or to put it in more academic terms, underlying presuppositions. And then you sound professorial and they pay attention to you more and so on. So I want to be clear that we're talking about a real entity here. And so when we came across the continent, cutting the forest ecosystems and plowing the prairie ecosystems, we were destroying some natural integrities that were more than containers. They were functional in the whole ecospheric realm. Now, so first of all, we're going to be clear. Now, I'd like a light so I can see the people's faces, because I can't lecture unless I see whether you people like it or not. It's important to, yeah, that's better. It's important to, first of all, make the distinction between the perennial and the annual. Now, I'm about to change your lives. And I'm sure that at the end of this period, there'll be an altar call here. But you're going to be very different people here in a little bit. Well, it's still not done. Any Boy Scouts around here to tie a slip knot? Oh, look at that. I get all sorts of help from on high. So here is an annual. That's the wheat plant that started civilization 10,000 years ago at the eastern end of the Mediterranean, where it's drying out at the end of the Pleistocene, somewhere in the Zagros Mountains of western Iran. That is the beginning of the extractive economy, because with that you have soil erosion, and in our time, fossil fuel dependency and so on. On the other hand, here is one of our perennial wheat relatives that we're working with. And so you got the story. This is a perennial, that's an annual. Okay, now the ecosystem, almost everywhere, tend to feature perennials in mixtures. And so let's see what I can do here. Maybe that light we maybe have a compromise. I see, let the light from your faces. All right. Howard T. Odum is an ecologist, was an ecologist. He died in the last 10 years or so. And he had a brother that was an ecologist too, University of Georgia. The Odum brothers were quite a force. And Howard T. Odum, this is a slide that out of his book, Environment, Power, and Society. And he's talking about the primitive earth. This is before there are organisms. And we had the conditions necessary for making ecosystems already in place. That we had energy arriving from the sun, striking water in a photochemical zone, and we had downstream reactions. So we had two things. We had sunlight and therefore the flow of energy. We also had nutrient cycling, material cycling, and early what we might call production consumption. And as a result of that sun's energy interacting with those elements that are now we recognize are necessary for making organisms, able to make what we call polymers, ways to store energy, or molecules. They would break apart, they would add, and so here's Odum's astonishing line. Ecosystems came ahead of cells. So we're dealing with something profound. We got two. Now, metabolism is something that comes later with organisms, but in a prairie or a rainforest, you've got to have the flow of energy and the cycling of materials, and he contends it was there in the early oceans. Now, his idea was, I think is wrong now, that it had its beginning with the sunlight in that photoreceptor area. Actually, the word now is, and I've never heard anybody with disagreeing on this now, life had its origin around those thermal vents of the ocean, where the heat coming out of those thermal vents provided the energy, and there was the cycling of the materials there. But that's another story, and I'm not going to dwell on that. That's, in a sense, a detail. That's still an ecosystem. Now, let's see. Now, remember, I told you that I got a job to do here tonight, and so I got to look at my notes. I want to come back to this hierarchy again to remind you that this system is given short shrift in the long history of science. And it's because of those early architects of science, Francis Bacon, René Descartes. Now let me just give you a little sense of what's going on. Copernicus is in the 1500s. He takes the earth out of the center and has the sun at the center. Galileo comes along and he has his telescope and he looks at the moons of Jupiter. Things are really, really at work. Then here's Francis Bacon in England. Rene Descartes in France, or wherever he was on the run from next, they got the idea advanced of the necessity to place priority on part over whole. And that is really the beginning of the reductive mind. Now, let it be clear, I don't object to being reductive, but the problem is that we should not regard the world like the method. In other words, that ecosphere, with its physical properties and the early ecosystems, gave rise to organisms. Organisms didn't give rise to it. So we've got, because we are organisms, an inside-out view. We call this a life support system, which is a way of giving priority to the biota, to organisms, and then the physical part of the world we tend to play fast and loose with. Example, the Earth's atmosphere. In other words, the atmosphere that we now are using as a dump, which is necessary for regulating the temperature of the Earth. The climatologists, in spite of everything that's come out about people sending stupid emails, that's another subject, and I can handle that one too. I'm on to this stuff. The playing fast and loose with that which is not living is a result of a bio-bias. But that ecosystem has even the spaces within a prairie are to be counted because that's where gases get exchanged, you see. So we're talking about a kind of an organismic view. That ecosphere, that miraculous skin, is what has given rise to organisms and is a creative force. An asteroid can hit the Yucatan Peninsula 65 million years ago. By the way, I read once that at the time that asteroid hit, it was the tail of it was as high as Mount Everest. I don't know who figured that out, but there are some ways you can get at compression, and it was coming in at about 50,000 miles an hour. So that's when the dinosaurs became extinct and made room then for the creative not super, supra-organism, a supra-organism called the ecosphere. Now, you're probably wondering, where's he going with this? Here we go. The rudiments of the ecosystems were already old before organisms came, and we know that the ecosphere and ecosystems have precedence in time over us, precedence in inclusiveness. They're more inclusive than we are, in complexity of organization. They're more complex, and they're more creative. In fact, the creativity we have is kind of pipsqueak creativity. I mean, we can't give rise really to new organisms unless you're a plant breeder at the Land Institute perennializing the major crops. Also, precedence as far as diversity. They're more diverse, they're more creative, they're more complex, they're more inclusive, and precedence in time. Now, how is it that the discipline of ecology is the most pecked over discipline in biology? Look at the salaries of faculty in universities. Look at the molecular end people versus the ecologists. Well, so not only is there a pecking order as far as where respect lies, there is also the pecking order as far as money. Now, why am I making a fuss out of this? In the U.S. Department of Agriculture, we've had considerable successes in getting high yields in corn, wheat, soybeans. On the world stage, due to the Green Revolution, starting around 1960 up to 2000, the world yields increased 2.5-fold. And now we're concerned about where we're going to get the yield increases over the next 30 or 40 years to feed a continuing expansion of the population. What doesn't get mentioned often enough is that if it were not for the Haber-Bosch process, the most important invention of the 20th century, in which we learned to take atmospheric nitrogen into 78% of the atmosphere is nitrogen, but that N2 is one of the strongest bonds in nature. It's very hard to break it. To break that and make ammonia that is then nitrogen fertilizer. Vaclav Smil, the nitrogen scholar, an energy scholar at University of Manitoba, says without the Haber-Bosch process, 40% of humanity wouldn't be here now. So here we are, we've got our yield increases, but soil erosion is very high on a global basis. It's still high here. We're putting in more chemicals for both the fertilizer, the pesticides, and so on. And they're asking, where are we going to get our gain? Well, who has been placed to be the head of the Food and Agriculture section within the USDA? A man that comes right out of the biotech industry. Who do they place as the head of USAID? A man that had worked for the Gates Foundation, an MD, a very smart guy. But the Gates Foundation has money that has come out of making things smaller and smaller and smaller, and the power that comes from that. Meanwhile, we neglect the fact, and this is Chris Field's paper in Science in 2001, in December 21, I think. Chris Field's summary in looking at the ecosystems of the planet, generally, not absolutely, but generally, nature's ecosystems have more net primary production than the human-managed systems that follow. Now, what is it then about the efficiencies that are inherent within those natural integrities of the ecosystems where those processes of the wild that ecologists have been looking at, evolutionary biologists have been looking at for a century or so, why is it that that reality is ignored while we continue the journey that got jump-started or greatly expanded at the time of Bacon and Descartes 1,600 years ago? So what I'm doing is making a plea for us to begin to look at the ecological end of the spectrum, first of all for agriculture, but also for forestry. Now, let's see. So, Well, you've heard me now. I'm doing all right, I can see. I was kind of wondering there for a minute. Okay, so now here's the problem. We've got not only that idea of the ecosystem being only a container, and my friend Arnold Schultz at UC Berkeley in the School of Forestry, when he got there in 1949, he's retired now, living in Boulder, but Arnold worked to get the idea. He looked at ecosystems up in the Arctic, ecosystems in California, and it was very hard to get across the idea that the ecosystem was more than a mere container. So he mostly failed at it. And so I think it's time for us to ask, what happened? Why is it? Well, the problem, of course, is what I call the problem of reassertion. We think that we get a grip on something, but we're living so much in a world of reductiveness. I mean, think of how many times we've been told, break a problem down to the point where there's no ambiguity. Well, of course, that's when it becomes totally irrelevant. Rather than to acknowledge that whole influences part, even as part influences whole. Now, here's what's interesting. In the common culture, for centuries, and Wendell Berry found this out, because he started looking at this question, going all the way back to Job, and continuing with some Greeks, and among the Romans, Virgil, the poet Virgil, the guy that Dante grabbed a hold of to work through the Inferno. There has been the idea of looking to nature, of nature as a measure. Wendell looked at the Romantic poets, Shakespeare, Spencer, Milton, all of those poets up to and including Alexander Pope in his Epistle to Burlington, all looked to nature as having practical value to inform us. In Pope's Epistle to Burlington, he says, let nature never be forgot. Consult the genius of the place in all. So the genius of the place, say, of the prairie, the genius of the forest. Russell Smith, in his book Tree Copse, talks about the forest. And Sir Albert Howard says, farm like the forest. But here's what Wendell found, that in that literary tradition among the Romantic poets, Shakespeare says, has the forest judge in As You Like It. Milton in Paradise Lost talks about it, and so on. But Wendell says, after Pope, this idea of nature having practical value to inform our behavior goes underground. And the next time it pops up is among scientists in 1900. And that's where Liberty Hyde Bailey, Sir Albert Howard comes, and some others. Now, let's tack on to that. Here comes Hugh Hammond Bennett with the Soil Conservation Service in 1935. And I've read a fair amount of what Bennett had to say. He says, look to nature. She is a lady that is fussy, and she can tell us how to farm. What happened? Well, what I think happened is none of them had the perennials. In other words, that diversity of roots that's there year-round makes it very hard to have the ecosystem's processes continue, because you're tearing the ground up every year. Now, Wendell's said another interesting thing. He said, after Pope, the Romantic poets used nature only as a reservoir of symbols, not as having any practical value. Kind of a way of showing their ability to handle the language or something. Now, but Wendell says, among the poets, among the scientists, which he calls the formal culture, in the formal culture, it comes as a series. It pops up now and then. But the idea is carried in the common culture, generation after generation after generation. So here was the opportunity with Hugh Hammond Bennett to put it in the formal culture and keep it going. The problem is Bennett was stuck with the reality that essentially all of our high-yielding crops, all of our grain crops, are annuals, and therefore the ecosystem concept. And now let's come back to Odom's first slide. Material cycling and energy flow, if those become disrupted or perverted in some way, then you do not get the ecological capital. And now also let's come to Chris Field's observation in that science paper in '01. Why is it that nature's ecosystems have more net primary production than the human-managed systems that follow? I'm going to show you some slides. Just to remind you that the Land Institute's doing something about perennializing the major crops, and why we are looking to the cereals, the oil seeds and pulses. That's 68 or around 70% of the calories and the agricultural land. Humans are primarily grass seed eaters. The number one grass of the planet is rice. The number two grass is wheat. The number three grass is corn. Those are the top three crops. Then there comes potato, then more grasses and legumes. So grass seed eaters primarily, legume seed eaters secondarily, but some fruits and vegetables, but only around 7%. Now, this is just another way of illustrating it. This, by the way, would be the average citizen of the world about 5 years ago. Now, this I took from an advertisement for a conference on sustainable agriculture to be held in Chicago. Well, what's missing? Well, that ear of corn is going to be sweet corn, you can bet. But that would have been the only grain. Well, you think, these people that put together these sustainable ag conferences and so on, well, they can't know very much. So let's look at what the New Yorker does. It has an article on Whole Foods. I took the man out of there because I didn't want to get sued. But for defamation of character, and I don't mean to defame his character at all. I think those are beautiful. But where are the grains? Here is a bias, a deep bias that we have. And here's Bruegel's 1565, the harvesters. And the largest percentage of that landscape, of course, is devoted to grains. And those trees, those are pear trees and apple trees. In the original, you can actually see people up in the trees picking them. But you notice they've limbed the trees up. And by the way, those are partridges there on the left flying across. I know that because they were pear trees. If you want to know anything, you ask me about how this is. Interpret this. But what are the people eating? They're eating bread, and they're eating probably porridge and milk and so on. The good question is the wheat tall or are the people short? Well, probably both. That straw is very important. I'll talk about that later. Well, here has been the gift of the gods for the Aztecs, Incas, and so on. But this has become the primary killer of our continent. Actually, this is now because there's more soybean acreage. And the reason is this time of year, April, where the brown is, that's about 100% corn or soybeans. It's bare. And south of here is what's called the Gulf of Mexico, and that brings moisture. And so you get this. And this. Now look, this is now. This is now, in spite of the Soil Conservation Service efforts. And here is a tile drain carrying clear water from a minimum till, no-till, and that milky water is coming out of a conventional till. So that tells us, if we don't know any more, that human cleverness can be corrective. Well, the sample out of that clear water has nitrogen 3 times above that of the acceptable level of the Environmental Protection Agency. Those perennial roots are elegant micromanagers of the nutrients and the water. And downstream, as a consequence, we have a dead zone. There are, according to Nancy Rabelais, thousands of them in the world. And this is 1,100 miles downstream. That dead zone's about the size of New Jersey. I like to show this slide because this is 1948, and here we have the dutiful 4-H girl and the county agent and brother with the poultry project and sis with the sewing project and dad back in the corner and grandpa in the corner. The dog's pleased with it. The chickens are interested. The cats, some of them are. But here we have expertise and youth that are central and tradition and experience peripheral. And this may have been our high watermark for possibility in American agriculture, in that the land-grant college system established in 1862 with the Morrill Act. 1887 came the Hatch Act for the experiment station, and in 1914 came the Smith-Lever Act for extension. So we got land-grant colleges in every state, we got experiment stations, and we got extension. And when that photograph or that painting was made, I would guess, well, Drake's oil well is 1859. I know that when I was born in 1936, around 1% of all the oil ever burned had been burned. I suspect by this time it was in the neighborhood, say, of 5%. We also know that the 10-year-old has lived through a quarter of all the oil ever burned. So here we have animal husbandry in the cow and the chickens. We got home economics, but I have bothered to check on that family. In fact, talked to the woman of the girl there on the left, Gamma Sue, and none of them are on the farm now. They left right after school. So why is that? Well, let's go back to 1948 and the beginning of the pesticide production and sales. And since Silent Spring, 1962, the pesticide industry has doubled and doubled again. Now, what does this have to do with the ecosystem concept? It represents, because of the annual monoculture, where you are faced with the epidemic if you don't spray. Why is it that that Kanza prairie does not have an epidemic? Well, because with species diversity, you have chemical diversity, which means it takes a tremendous enzyme system on the part of an insect or a pathogen to give you the epidemic. And we put, starting also about 1948, more nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. Phosphorus goes up, more irrigation wells go in, and the use of nitrogen goes up. And we know, as a matter of good data, that the annual crops lose about half the nitrogen that is applied to the field. It just goes right through or runs off. On the other hand, your prairie is utilizing the nitrogen. Well, also around 1948 and thereafter, we began to have farm auctions. And remember, I think it was Ezra Taft Benson that said, "Get big or get out." And then it wasn't long after that when Earl Butt said, "Fence row to fence row." That is the beginning of the kind of export policy. And here is one of the important things about an ecosystem and evolution. All adaptation is local. So once you begin to widen your loops away from the farm, and all driven by fossil carbon, now you begin to interrupt some of those processes that are basic, even going back to the physical system that Odom talked about before organisms were present. Now, I asked earlier whether that straw was, the wheat was tall or the people short. The barn, the loft of the barn, is the fuel tank for the farm, dispersed energy. Below is where the animals were, and the straw sopped up the urine, which is nitrogen, and manure. But if you introduce fossil carbon into your system, no longer do you need the barn. And so here was a rather complex information system that these people were part of. I think there's a general law. High energy destroys information of the cultural and biological varieties. The loss of wild biodiversity in the tropics is the consequence of tearing down rainforests to plant the likes of soybeans or sugar cane or whatever for biofuels. So we're lucky to live here in Missouri, Kansas, because being grass seed eaters, we need this prairie as a standard against which to judge our future agricultural practices once we get these perennials up and begin to put them in mixtures. This prairie has answers to questions we've not yet learned to ask. And that's a real economy right there. And the reason, what's so interesting to me, is that the elements necessary for life, 20 some are in the upper third of the periodic chart. There are only 4 of those in the atmospheric commons. The rest of them are from the surface downward. in the soil. So that, to me, explains the different root architectures for getting at the stuff we're made of. I mean, humans are nothing more than intermediate stops between dirt. So here we are perennializing the major crops, wheat. We do this, make crosses in the greenhouse. Sometimes once you harvest, if the green shoots come up, we say, okay, that's a perennial. And here is, actually this plant here is the same as the Kernza. We gave that a trademark name, Kernza, TM. That's sort of to keep the pesky people from trying to appropriate it too soon. But here you see the story. We plant wheat in September. You can't even see it coming up. Here is the one already present. Here wheat has grown a little. Here it is still in December. March, it's grown some more. And finally, at the time of harvest, there it is. We need to work on corn. That's going to take a long time. We're making good progress with perennial sorghum. That's a very important crop in Africa for human food. We use it here for livestock food. And perennializing sunflower, and a relative of the sunflowers, the silphiums. And then we're also supporting the perennialization of the upland rice in China. Those hills are eroding terribly. They'll plant the rice and maybe get 2 crops, and then the erosion wipes it out. So, and by the way, agriculture is the #1 threat to biodiversity, mostly in third world countries. And here's an example of trying to grow upland rice in Indonesia. Is this catching on? Yes, it's catching on at different places around the world, and with various perennials. Some of our perennial wheat is, germplasm is in Australia and in Manitoba and some other places. Perennial rice in China, our people go over there, 2 or 3 of them every year to look in on that effort. So it's getting a little bit of traction. But now, could I have the lights, please? I'm going to stop the slides here. Now, here's what is mildly worrisome to me. We are so used to thinking about monocultures that we talk about a perennial wheat or a perennial sorghum or a perennial corn or a perennial sunflower, and we imagine fields of monocultures. What I'm arguing for is that the ecosystem requires us to start with the question, what was here? And the next question is, what will nature require of us here? And the third one is, what will nature help us do here? In some places, like the Nile Valley, Mississippi Valley, some places, I can see some perennial monocultures maybe, but we'll be foregoing something if we don't have that diversity. Because let's come back to that slab of space-time that tends to feature diversity. That diversity means something. For instance, there are microbes that interact with the roots of legumes that fix atmospheric nitrogen at 4/5 of an atmosphere and an ambient temperature. Ammonia is made at 350 atmospheres and 400 degrees C in a plant. So here is a very fossil fuel intensive. So what we're after is the efficiencies that are inherent within the natural integrities that the ecosystem concept offers. Here's part of the problem. Ecologists have been at work to understand how the world is or the world works. They have had the luxury to be descriptive. Agriculturists have had the burden to be prescriptive. You got to have food every year. So the agronomist will prescribe, the ecologist will describe. Now, hard-headed realism, in a certain sense, is what is hurting us in seeing the necessity for the ecosystem. Wendell Berry said once to me on the phone, a hard-headed realist is somebody who uses a lot less information than what's available. So what we need, it seems to me, friends, we need to look to the ecosystem and all that knowledge that's been getting put on the shelf for its own sake, understanding how the natural world works. Bring it off the shelf and dust it off and start applying it to a fundamentally different agricultural research agenda. Because right now, billions going into that molecular end, splicing in a gene for, say, drought resistant. Now, let me put it this way. I do not object to molecular biology. I don't object to people doing as much as they can. I mean, we'll use molecular markers in our own work. But let's imagine here's the ecosystem or the ecological end of the spectrum, the most pecked over, and here is molecular biology. It ought to be quivering in the service of this larger ecological end. Right now, this is essentially ignored and this is elevated. So that is my message. Now, if you don't like what I had to say, I'm ready to take it all back. Let me see if I have something else here that... all right. Yeah, I have something to say. We can now solve the oldest environmental problem. With agriculture, when we were gatherers and hunters until 10 to 12,000 years ago. And that was where we got at the first pool of non-renewable carbon, non-renewable given the rate at which we are wasting it and spending it. And that agriculture made civilization possible. The next pool was 5,000 years ago. 5,000 years into agriculture. I mean, remember what we got in that first 5,000 years, quite a bit. I mean, there were things happening in Sumer and other places and some insights, but 5,000 years ago, we used forests to smelt the ore for the Bronze Age and later the Iron Age. Reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, and who was a real king. And he's telling about his friend that's dying, and he's telling his friend what's going to weep for him, and what's going to weep for him, and he lists a whole bunch of animals, including, and he also lists the cedar forests of that area, and the clear waters of the Euphrates that we drank from. Salting, desertification, all of that. And then, of course, later, Solomon strikes a deal with the king of Tyre to buy the cedars of Lebanon. By the time of Charlemagne, an enlightened ruler, the onslaught of the forests was well underway. 250 years ago, before coal, already the forests of England were so decimated that they were now going to Ireland in order to smelt the iron. So we have had this relentless going from the first pool of energy-rich carbon, the young pulverized coal of the soil, then the forest carbon, and then 250 years ago, coal that made possible the Industrial Revolution, and then 1859 is Drake's oil well. And we had been using natural gas for lighting and some other things, but we started using it for power about the time of coal. So we've been going through these 5 pools, and what we have done is disrupt the natural processes and then subsidize those processes with the fossil carbon. You see? So the ecosystem as a conceptual tool for the management of our agricultural lands and the management generally of our resources, it seems to me, is an imperative. So we can solve the oldest environmental problem with perennials and the ecosystem concept. We just have to bring the knowledge off the shelf that's already there. I think that we can safely say that at the time of the Copernican revolution, we didn't need it. Glad we got it. We didn't really need Newton's calculus at the time we got it. We didn't need Lavoisier's chemistry at the time we got it. I'm glad we now have it. So we can just go right along. We didn't even need Darwin's insight, but we got it. But without soil carbon, forest carbon, and coal, we would have never had Darwin. The slack that was available to the British Empire to send a ship around the world with a naturalist on it, and then come back, and the slack that made it possible for him to sit and pore over specimens and write letters and study earthworms. That's his last book. That's a brilliant piece. Those are the consequence of the slack that was made available as a result of the extractive economy. And then you can bring that right on up to the moment of, bring it up to, you know, Einstein's equations, or the Hubble telescope, and all that we now understand from the heavens. This building, which houses 32 miles of shelf devoted to the knowledge that was made possible through science, technology, engineering. That came as the consequence of our first break with the natural ecosystem 10,000 years ago. Now, here's the challenge. First of all, if we can keep ourselves fed, I think it's safe to say that the conceptual change that is now necessary, I don't finish that first sentence, forget it. The conceptual change that's necessary is the one that I'm talking about now. To embrace the way nature's ecosystems have worked over millions of years to inform a fundamentally different way of living here. And that will allow us to save the soils and may serve as a kind of prototype, metaphorical way of thinking about how to live in an economy that's resilient instead of one that's dependent upon the drawdown of the capital stock of the planet. That's all I have to say.
We have a microphone for questions. My question is, I believe at the end of January, you were in Berkeley at the Center for Eco-Literacy. You were at a Fellows Conference, and you had a presentation by Rob Hopkin from the Transition Town movement. And I'm really curious with the people there, with yourself. I mean, some of the people that are fellows of the post-carbon are incredible, including yourself. And I'm wondering what came out of that conference. I understand it was a brainstorming session on kind of how to fix the world. And I'm wondering if you think the Transition Town movement plays into that or could potentially play into that.
Yeah, the next question, please. Well, let me struggle with a... I mean, that's a question that really goes beyond any available answer. But let's take a stab at it. The people that are the post-carbon fellows are folk that recognize that the party's about over. And they're trying to figure out how we're going to make a transition and have a soft landing. I can't speak. I think that we're too green at this to know. Let me tell you, I'll tell you why I think we're too green. Marty Bender, who we lost at a too early age, was in charge of our 10-year Sunshine Farm at the Land Institute. 210 acres, the sunlight that fell on that farm had to pay all the bills. And to then get an idea of how much could go through the farm gate. And we had a biodiesel tractor and grew soybeans and sunflowers. We had a 70 head of longhorn cattle, if you count the calves. We had photovoltaic panels. We had draft horses, we had chickens, and so on. And here's what happened to me during that process as Marty and I were trying to decide where to draw the line. Marty went all the way back to mining the ore in the Minnesota Iron Range to build the tractor, or to mine the ore, to build the tractor, to processing in Gary and assembly, and so on. And even a 1-pound bolt was the embodied energy had to be charged against it. And we had a lot of conversations. Where do you draw the line? And I asked Marty once, where, in the literature, Marty, where are they drawing the line? He says, when they get tired. Now, what that 10 years taught me is that the scaffolding of civilization that has been put there with highly dense energy, oil, natural gas, coal, most of it is not going to be repaired with dispersed energy sources. So we are going to, there's not going to be a path laid out. We're going to have to do a lot of hard thinking about where our priorities are. The potholes, how do we charge the trip? How much of the road into town to get that bolt do we charge against that farm and the food production? You see what I mean about the scaffolding? So to me, the argument is still too green for us to know how it's going to work with the transition towns. And that's another way of saying I don't know. Yeah. Yeah.
Would this be a good segue into what you're talking about with the new farm bill? That sounds really exciting that you're working on for the future.
Yeah. Oh yeah, the 50-year farm bill. I got slides on the 50-year farm bill up here, but I'm not going to show them. What we're calling for is that the 5-year farm bills be mere mileposts to move agriculture from 80% annuals, 20% perennials, to have that reversed in a 50-year period. by changing the nature of the subsidies that are predicated on export policy to help offset the balance of payment deficit for foreign oil and gewgaws, that once you have export policy driving your farm bills that turns crops into commodities, then de facto you're trading topsoil for Toyotas. So what this 50-year farm bill does is start with the list of changes that start with soil conservation and the development of an agriculture that uses the ecosystem as a conceptual tool featuring the perennials. So I got slides to show, but make one of my words worth 1,000 pictures. Let's see. Yeah, somewhere there.
Do you think that any of this is possible without seriously addressing the uncomfortable topic of meat consumption and the calories that are lost in that, and transportation, and how that fits into this whole picture you're talking about?
Yeah. Well, the cattle and pig welfare program, of course, is a disaster. It's the biggest welfare program in the history of the planet if you just weigh it up. And we recognize the problem of widening that loop away from the farm. I mean, to me, it's really odd to drive through Kansas and Iowa and not see fences anymore. So, what we imagine for a future agriculture predicated on the processes of the wild prairie is grazing and fire, not the feedlot. Grazing and fire, and get the butchering right back to the local place so that you don't have to, right now we're sending milk to Los Angeles from western Kansas. It's just nuts, all these things. So if we start with the idea that essentially all adaptation is local, this is one of the valuable things about the sustainable ag movement. Even though they're not featuring perennials, they're featuring these annuals, at least they're talking about local. And the next step for them is to get to the soil and water resource itself. But I see we're going to have animals for management as well as fire, as I mentioned. But that would be a lot less eating of meat. I mean, it would really cut it down. So I don't know. I mean, the prairie's had the big herbivore. Don't discount it.
How do you harvest a diversified prairie?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. Several years ago, that question had come up so many times that we decided in an 8-acre patch, we did it 2 years in a row, we planted corn, sorghum, sunflowers, and soybeans. Corn and sorghum are warm season grasses, soybeans a legume, and sunflowers, of course, in the sunflower family. Those are 3 of the 4 what we might call functional groups of the prairie. All right, we planted them with an air drill, and then we opened up in a mix, we opened up the concave on the combine, and we cut the air so we wouldn't blow the sunflower seeds out the back, and harvested this instant granola right in the field. Then separated the seeds with a seed cleaner. And we got pretty good separation. There are some seeds that were close enough the same size, but at the grain elevator, they got those centrifugal drums that'll separate the seeds. So those are mechanical engineering problems that, I mean, it'll be a different kind of combine than what we used, I imagine, in the future. The larger problem is to get agronomists and ecologists working together and getting the U.S. Department of Agriculture to hire 80 PhD level geneticists and 30 ecologists and make this great transformation possible. But they're children of Bacon and Descartes and doing this tired old reductive thing. I mean, this is the thing about molecular biology. It's not new, it's painfully old. You know, let's do something new. Well, let's see. How we doing?
I think that's it. Thank you, Dr. Jackson.
Yeah, all right. Yeah.
And thank you for attending tonight's lecture. Please join us April 22nd for our next exhibit opening outside the sphere with Dr. Bill Ashworth delivering the opening lecture. Thank you and good night.